I was a simple prophet and messenger of God, known for my unwavering faith until the day it was put to the test, challenging the kings of Israel and pagan gods. In this video, you will discover how I faced threats to my life, challenged prophets, summoned fire from the skies, had contact with angels, and how you can also face your obstacles. My name is Elijah, and this is my story. Elijah was a very important prophet in Israel who lived in the 9th century BC. He became famous even without having books written solely about him. His story occurred during the reigns of Ahab and Ahaziah, two important kings of Israel. Elijah was a prophet who did incredible things, and once he went to speak to King Ahab in a rather surprising manner. He declared that it would not rain until he said so. After that, God instructed Elijah to hide near a brook, where birds brought him food every day. When the brook dried up, God told Elijah to go to a city called Zarephath, where a widow would take care of him. There, Elijah met the widow and asked for something unusual, that she make a cake for him before making food for herself and her son. He promised that if she did this, there would be no shortage of flour or oil until the drought ended. The widow was almost out of food and was afraid to do what Elijah asked, thinking it might leave her son without food. But Elijah told her to trust that everything would be all right. Elijah promised the widow that God would take care of her, and because of the woman's faith, the miracle happened. The flour and oil did not run out during the drought, and her son was saved. But the story becomes even more thrilling when her son becomes very ill, to the point of stopping breathing. The desperate mother thought it was a punishment for her sins and confided in Elijah. Elijah wasted no time, took the boy, carried him to the room where he was staying, and prayed fervently to God that the boy would come back to life. After 3 intense prayers, God heard Elijah, and the boy revived, to his mother's joy. She then recognized Elijah as a true man of God. This showed how faithful Elijah was and had a strong connection with God, who always responds to people's trust. The story of Elijah does not end there. The next major event occurred on Mount Carmel, where the future of Israel was decided. After 3 years of drought, God told Elijah to speak to King Ahab because it was going to rain again. Elijah followed God's instructions and went to face this challenge. Samaria faced a severe famine, and King Ahab sought help from Obadiah, a man who greatly feared God and worked for him. While Ahab's wife, Jezebel, hunted and killed the prophets of God, Obadiah had the courage to hide 100 prophets in 2 caves to protect them. To find food for the animals and prevent them from dying, Ahab and Obadiah split up to explore different areas. During his search, Obadiah encountered Elijah, the prophet everyone was looking for, and fell at his feet, recognizing him and asking if he was indeed Elijah. Elijah reassured Obadiah and said he would speak to Ahab. But Obadiah was afraid of being killed for bringing the news to Ahab, explaining how he had protected God's prophets from Jezebel's actions. This story heightens the anticipation for the dramatic confrontation on Mount Carmel, where faith, courage, and divine power would be tested. In this historic challenge, Elijah faced King Ahab, who called him the troubler of Israel. With great courage, Elijah returned the accusation, saying that the king and his family were the real culprits for abandoning the faith. Elijah challenged King Ahab to prove who was the true God. He asked Ahab to gather the people of Israel at Mount Carmel, including 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who were supported by Queen Jezebel. When everyone was there, Elijah asked the people how long they would waver between following the Lord or Baal. No one answered. Then Elijah proposed a test. They should prepare 2 bulls for sacrifice, one for the prophets of Baal and another for him, without lighting the fire themselves. They would call on their gods, and the God who answered by fire would be considered the true God. Everyone agreed to the plan. The prophets of Baal tried first. They prepared their bull and called on Baal from morning until noon, but nothing happened. No fire came, nor voice, nor any sign from Baal. Elijah even mocked them, suggesting that perhaps their God was busy or sleeping. The prophets of Baal became so desperate that they started to cut themselves, hoping for a response, but still nothing happened. After the prophets of Baal failed, it was Elijah's turn. He started by repairing a Lord's altar that had been destroyed, using 12 stones to represent the tribes of Israel. Elijah built the altar, placed wood and the prepared bowl on top. To make the test even more challenging, he asked that 4 jars of water be poured over the altar, doing this 3 times until water filled a trench around the altar, soaking everything thoroughly. At the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah, with great confidence, approached the altar and asked God to show that he was the true God of Israel and that Elijah was his servant. He requested this so that the people would turn back to believe in him. Responding to Elijah's prayer, fire fell from the sky, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even drying up the water in the trench. This miracle was so impressive that it caused all the people present, who had been hesitant and uncertain, to fall on their knees in deep respect and worship. They loudly and convincingly acknowledged that the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. This event not only demonstrated God's immense power, but also restored the people's faith in their true and only God. After an extraordinary event that rekindled the faith and trust of the people in God, Elijah, following his mission as a prophet, made a firm decision. He ordered the capture of all the prophets of the false god Baal and managed to ensure that none of them escaped. This act was a significant step toward eliminating the negative influence of these prophets among the people. Then, Elijah had a crucial moment with King Ahab. He warned the king to prepare because something much awaited was about to happen. The rain was finally going to fall on the dry land. The sky soon filled with dark clouds, the wind began to blow stronger, and a heavy rain started to fall. This rain was the fulfillment of God's promise, bringing relief and hope to the land and to the people who had suffered so much from the drought. Elijah, strengthened and encouraged by divine power, performed an impressive feat. He tucked his cloak into his belt and ran with supernatural speed, arriving ahead of King Ahab to the city of Jezreel. This moment was a true triumph and a celebration of God's faithfulness, who not only answered Elijah's prayers on Mount Carmel, but also sent the rain everyone so desperately needed. However, not everyone was happy with these miracles. Queen Jezebel, known for her wickedness and opposition to the followers of the true God, was furious when she learned what Elijah had done. She vowed to take revenge on the prophet and sent a death threat, causing Elijah, fearing for his life, to flee. Elijah, now afraid and alone, embarked on a long journey into the desert. During this escape, he reached a point of total exhaustion and despair. Feeling completely overwhelmed, Elijah even wished for death. Seeking refuge, he lay down under a broom tree, asking God to take his life. But even in this moment of deep discouragement, God did not abandon him. While Elijah slept, an angel of the Lord came to him, touching him gently and offering food and water. The angel encouraged Elijah to eat well, for the journey ahead would still be long and full of challenges. Following the angel's advice, Elijah ate and drank, and, miraculously strengthened by this divine food, was able to travel for 40 days and 40 nights. After a long and exhausting journey, Elijah arrived at Mount Horeb, also known as the Mountain of God. Meanwhile, Queen Jezebel, with a heart full of vengeance, continued her relentless search for Elijah, mistakenly believing that he had already met his end. At Mount Horeb, Elijah found refuge in a cave to spend the night. There, God questioned him about what he was doing there. With a heavy heart, Elijah shared his intense zeal for the Lord and expressed his deep sorrow over the declining spiritual state of Israel. He spoke about how the people had broken their covenant with God, destroyed the sacred altars, and killed the prophets. Elijah felt desolate, believing himself to be the last faithful to the Lord, now with his own life threatened. God, in his infinite compassion and wisdom, decided to reveal his presence to Elijah in an extraordinarily special way. First, a strong and powerful wind tore the mountains, but God was not in the wind. After that, an earthquake shook the earth, but again, God was not present in it. Then came an intense fire, but God was not in the fire either. Finally, a gentle and serene voice came. Elijah immediately recognized it as the voice of the Lord. Upon hearing this delicate voice, Elijah covered his face with his cloak, stepped out of the cave, and presented himself before God. God then asked Elijah the same question, "What are you doing here?" Elijah repeated his concerns and his fervent commitment to the Lord. In response, God gave Elijah clear and meaningful instructions for the next step of his mission. He was to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha to be the prophet who would succeed Elijah. Moreover, God comforted Elijah, revealing to him that there were 7,000 people in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, showing Elijah that he was not alone in his devotion. Revitalized and strengthened by this intimate encounter with God, Elijah was ready to move forward. Now he knew that he was not alone, had a clear mission ahead, and the direct support of God. This gave him the necessary strength to continue serving the Lord, fulfilling the tasks entrusted to him with renewed zeal and determination. After receiving direct instructions from God, Elijah wasted no time and set out to find the person who would be his successor, Elisha. He found Elisha working hard in the field, plowing the land with 12 pairs of oxen. As he approached, Elijah made a symbolic and significant gesture. He threw his cloak over Elisha. This act represented a divine call to a new life, a life dedicated to serving God as a prophet. Elisha, understanding the meaning of this gesture, did not hesitate. He was willing to accept this new mission but first wanted to say goodbye to his parents. Elijah agreed, showing he understood the importance of this farewell moment. Elisha then did something that demonstrated his total commitment to his new vocation. He sacrificed the oxen he had been using to plow and prepared a large meal for the people. This act symbolized his departure from his previous life and the full acceptance of the call to follow Elijah and serve God. Meanwhile, in the city of Damascus, King Ben-Hadad of Syria was gravely ill. Concerned about his future, he sent Hazael with a significant gift to find Elisha, the prophet who succeeded Elijah, to inquire if he would recover from his illness. Hazael met Elisha and asked the question on behalf of the king. After consulting God, Elisha gave a shocking answer. King Ben-Hadad would die. But it was what happened afterward that became even more remarkable. Elisha fixed his gaze on Hazael and, inexplicably, began to weep. Confused, Hazael asked why the prophet was crying. Elisha then revealed a grim future. He knew that Hazael would commit terrible acts against the people of Israel, including acts of violence and destruction. Surprised and perhaps a bit incredulous, Hazael questioned how he, merely a servant, could carry out such atrocities. Elisha revealed that God had shown him Hazael would become the king of Syria. The next day, Hazael returned to King Ben-Hadad and, in an act of betrayal, murdered him, assuming the throne of Syria. Thus, Elisha's painful predictions began to take shape, marking a new and challenging chapter for the people of Israel. In the days when Elisha assumed the role of prophet, succeeding Elijah, significant changes were happening in Israel and Syria, according to divine plans. Elisha fulfilled the task of anointing Hazael as king of Syria and Jehu as king of Israel. These events marked a crucial turning point in the history of these kingdoms. During this time, in Jezreel, a man named Naboth owned a vineyard that was very close to the palace of King Ahab, who ruled in Samaria. King Ahab desired this vineyard for himself so much that he offered Naboth money or another vineyard in exchange if he was willing to sell. However, Naboth refused the king's offer. He explained that the vineyard was a precious inheritance from his family, passed down from generation to generation, and he could not part with it. Naboth's refusal to sell the vineyard left Ahab frustrated and deeply dissatisfied. Jezebel, his wife, seeing her husband so dejected, decided to take matters into her own hands. She devised a sinister plan to acquire the vineyard for Ahab. Jezebel used the king's name to write letters to the leaders of the city where Naboth lived, ordering them to organize a fast and give Naboth a place of honor during the event. Furthermore, she instructed that 2 unscrupulous men falsely accuse Naboth of blaspheming against God and the king. As a result of these fabricated accusations, Naboth was condemned and stoned to death. When Jezebel informed Ahab that Naboth was dead, the king quickly went to the vineyard to take possession of it. However, what Ahab did not expect was that his actions would have serious consequences. God sent Elijah to confront Ahab in Naboth's vineyard. Elijah came before the king and announced a prophecy of divine condemnation. God was aware of all the evil that Ahab had done, especially his involvement in the unjust death of Naboth. God's punishment would be severe. Ahab's family would face destruction, just as had happened with previous royal families, such as those of Jeroboam and Baasha, because of their wickedness and injustices. Following the tragic story involving Naboth's vineyard, God, through the prophet Elijah, announced harsh consequences for King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, due to their unjust actions and Jezebel's corrupt influence. Among the punishments was the terrible fate of Jezebel, who would be devoured by dogs within the walls of Jezreel, while the birds of the sky would take care of those who died in the field. When Ahab heard these prophetic words, his repentance was immediate and profound. He tore his clothes in a sign of mourning, dressed in sackcloth, a coarse fabric used in times of great sorrow or penitence, fasted, and showed his remorse. This gesture of repentance from Ahab led God to postpone the punishment he had announced. However, Ahab's reign continued to be marked by his mistakes and the continued idol worship in Israel. After Ahab's death, his son Ahaziah took the throne of Israel. Soon, Ahaziah faced his own challenge when he suffered a severe injury. In search of answers about his recovery, he decided to send messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, a decision that demonstrated his disobedience to God. Elijah, knowing the king's intention, intercepted the messengers and announced that, due to his rebellion, Ahaziah would not recover. When Ahaziah learned of Elijah's intervention, he tried to capture the prophet, sending a captain and 50 men. However, when they encountered Elijah, the prophet called down fire from heaven, which consumed the captain and his men. Incredibly, the king repeated the action, sending another group of 50 men, who met the same terrible fate. This cycle of events emphasizes Elijah's authority as a prophet and the seriousness of disobeying God. After 2 failed attempts to capture Elijah, where the envoys were consumed by fire from heaven, King Ahaziah tried for the 3rd time. This time, the captain of the group approached with a different request. Instead of demanding, he pleaded for his life and the lives of his men. Seeing the humility and respect of this captain, Elijah decided to accompany them safely. The prophet kept his word, predicting that King Ahaziah would not recover from his injury. Just as Elijah had said, Ahaziah died, and Jehoram took his place as king of Israel. Meanwhile, the life of the prophet Elijah was about to experience an extraordinary event. He and his successor, Elisha, were traveling between the prophetic schools of Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho. During this journey, Elijah tried to leave Elisha behind at Gilgal and then at Bethel, but Elisha refused to leave him, promising to stay by his side until the end. They knew, as did the sons of the prophets, that Elijah's time on earth was coming to an end. As they left Jericho, they performed a miraculous act. They crossed the Jordan River, which parted upon being touched by Elijah's cloak. At this poignant moment, Elijah asked Elisha what he wished for before he was taken away. Elisha, seeking to follow in his master's footsteps with the same strength and wisdom, asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Elijah agreed with the condition that Elisha should see him being taken into heaven. Not long after, a chariot and horses of fire appeared, separating them, and a whirlwind took Elijah to heaven, while Elisha watched, moved. After Elijah's departure, Elisha picked up the cloak that his master had dropped, crossed the Jordan again, and returned to Jericho. The sons of the prophets, who were in Jericho, saw Elisha return and immediately recognized that the spirit of Elijah was now with him. They approached and prostrated themselves before Elisha, recognizing him as the legitimate successor of Elijah. This moment was crucial not only for Elisha but for the entire prophetic community. It showed the continuity of divine work through Elisha and the fulfillment of God's promise to Elijah. The passing of the mantle between the 2 prophets is a striking example of faith, loyalty, and the continuation of the divine mission on earth. After Elisha took up the mantle of prophet succeeding Elijah, the sons of the prophets from Jericho came to him. They bowed before him in a sign of respect and insistently asked to search for Elijah, believing perhaps that he might be found somewhere on earth, despite having been taken to heaven. Reluctantly, but acquiescing to their request, Elisha allowed 50 men to go in search of Elijah. But, as expected, they did not find him. When Jehu became king, he remembered the prophecy made by Elijah, which predicted the ruin of Ahab's house due to its many sins and injustices. Jehu used this prophecy as justification to eliminate all of Ahab's descendants, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord. As recorded in 1 Kings, the prophecy was a severe sentence against Ahab and his lineage, promising to eradicate all men, both bonded and free in Israel. Jehu then acted with determination, killing all the remnants of Ahab's house in Jezreel, including its leaders and close associates. Afterward, he proceeded to Samaria, where he continued his mission, even finding and killing the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah. During the reign of King Ahab in Israel, the worship of Baal was widespread. Baal, considered a deity of nature and originating from Tyre, had one of his most important worship centers in Mecca. Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Tyre and Sidon, intensified the promotion of Baal worship in Israel. Jezebel, notorious for her opposition to the prophets of the Lord, propelled this pagan worship and persecuted the faithful servants of God. The story of Elijah does not end in the Old Testament. He is mentioned in the book of Malachi, where his return is prophesied before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, a reference that finds an echo in the New Testament and points both to the coming of John the Baptist and to future events. The angel of the Lord, in announcing the birth of John the Baptist to Zechariah, predicted that John would go on in the spirit and power of Elijah, with the mission of turning hearts and reconciling fathers and children, preparing the way for the Lord. Although John the Baptist denied being Elijah reincarnated, Jesus referred to him as such, recognizing that John fulfilled the Elijah-like mission of preparing the way for the Messiah. Thus, the life and ministry of Elijah extend beyond his earthly existence, influencing the Judeo-Christian faith and symbolizing the power of God among his people, the fight against idolatry, and the call to repentance and restoration. The biblical story of Elijah and his connection to John the Baptist is intriguing and fundamental for understanding the prophetic mission that prepares the way for Jesus. When questioned about his identity, John the Baptist denies being the reincarnated Elijah or the expected prophet, like Moses, despite Jewish expectations. Instead, he identifies himself as the voice of one crying in the wilderness, quoting Isaiah and emphasizing his role in preparing the way for the Lord. This episode reveals the confusion and curiosity among the religious leaders of the time, especially the Pharisees, about who John the Baptist was if he did not consider himself to be the Christ, Elijah, or the prophet. They questioned John's authority to baptize, given his response. On the other hand, in Matthew, Jesus explicitly identifies John the Baptist as the Elijah who was to come, a statement that seems to contradict John's denial of being Elijah. Jesus points to John as the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy, encouraging those willing to accept, to recognize John as the prophetic figure who prepares the way for the Messiah. This complexity is deepened in Matthew, where Jesus clarifies to the disciples that Elijah would indeed come first to restore all things, according to prophecy. However, he also reveals that Elijah has already come, referring to John the Baptist, and that people did not recognize him, implying that John suffered injustices similar to those that Jesus would face. Interestingly, some people in Jesus' time believed that he himself might be Elijah, as shown in Matthew and Mark. These speculations about Jesus' identity included comparisons with John the Baptist, Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets, reflecting the expectation of a prophetic Messiah and confusion about how Jesus fit into these expectations. Elijah embodies the figure of the faithful who, even in the face of great challenges and threats like Jezebel's persecution, does not bend or retreat, remaining steadfast in his divine mission. He inspires us to be like the 7,000 faithful who, even surrounded by idolatry and apostasy, did not bow to Baal, staying loyal to the true God. May the story of Elijah motivate us to maintain our faith and prayer, especially in moments when we face adversities that seem insurmountable. Like Elijah, we are called to be a remnant that not only survives but thrives by living according to God's will, using prayer as a powerful tool to face and overcome challenges.